Okay, let's dive in. Imagine this for a second. Someone's legally living here in the U.S., right?
Hmm.
And they have a court order, a specific legal order, saying, do not deport this person to this country.
A protection, essentially.
Exactly. And then somehow they end up deported to that exact country. And not just deported, but thrown in prison there.
It sounds unbelievable almost.
It really does.
Yeah.
But that's pretty much the core of what we're talking about today, the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
And what's really striking, I think, is how this one person's story just ripples out. It touches on fundamental rights, government power.
The role of the courts.
Absolutely. The whole system, really.
So let's set the scene a bit. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, he's originally from El Salvador. He came to the U.S. back in, 2011, as a teenager.
Yeah, fleeing gang threats, Barrio 18, specifically. A really dangerous situation he was escaping.
And importantly, in 2019, he was granted something called withholding of removal by an immigration judge.
Which is a key point. It's not citizenship, but it's a formal legal status.
Right. The court acknowledged the danger he faced back in El Salvador. So legally, he couldn't be sent back there.
And he was living his life here in Maryland with his wife and kids, who are all U.S. citizens, checking in with ICE regularly, doing what he was supposed to do.
Then, fast forward to March 2025, he gets deported to El Salvador.
The very place he was protected from being sent to.
And the Trump administration's initial line on this, they called it an administrative error.
Just an error. But the consequences were huge. He wasn't just sent back. He was immediately imprisoned in El Salvador's terrorism confinement center, CECOT.
And this CECOT place, it's notorious, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's a maximum security facility known for incredibly harsh conditions. We're talking severe overcrowding, minimal basic facilities, almost no contact with the outside world. It's grim.
And here's a really crucial detail. His imprisonment there wasn't some random thing by El Salvador. It happened under an agreement, an arrangement, where the U.S. actually pays El Salvador to house certain deportees.
So the U.S. government was, in effect, funding his detention in this specific, harsh prison after deporting him there against a court order.
It just adds another layer, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So how did the U.S. government justify this, especially given the withholding of removal status?
Well, the official justification shifted. They accused him of being a member of MS-13.
MS-13, that's a different gang than the one he fled from, Barrio 18.
Exactly. And MS-13 is designated a terrorist organization by the U.S. But here's the thing. This accusation wasn't based on, say, a criminal conviction for gang activity.
Okay, so where did it come from then?
It seems to trace back to a bail determination hearing in immigration court back in 2019, a hearing that Abrego Garcia himself disputed at the time.
And the evidence used in that hearing?
That's where it gets, well, questionable. Part of the evidence cited was him wearing a Chicago Bulls hat.
Oh, hat? Seriously?
And a hoodie with money designs on it. This was presented as indicative of Hispanic gang culture.
Wow. Okay. Well,
there was also testimony from a confidential source. Now, this source was later connected to a law enforcement officer who themselves got into trouble, suspended, convicted of misconduct.
So the source's credibility is shaky, to say the least.
You could say that. And this source claimed Abrego Garcia was part of an MS-13 clique, the Western clique in New York.
But didn't he live in Maryland? Did he even live in New York?
Nope, never lived there. And the source mentioned a specific rank he supposedly held. Gang experts later pointed out that the rank mentioned isn't even a real rank used by MS-13.
So questionable evidence from a questionable source about a place he didn't live, citing a rank that doesn't exist. That was part of the justification.
That appears to be a significant part of the basis for the MS-13 allegation used later. It really makes you wonder about the intelligence gathering and how it's used, especially when it overrides a legal protection.
Were there other things the administration pointed to?
Yes, they also brought up some past incidents. There was a protective order his wife sought in 2021 during a disagreement, but it was dismissed.
And his wife commented on that?
She did. She said it was really just out of caution after they'd argued, and emphasized that he's a loving husband and father.
Okay. Anything else?
There was also a traffic stop in Tennessee in 2022. He was with some other guys traveling for construction work. Someone apparently alleged gang affiliation, so ICE was called.
And did ICE take him then?
No, ICE actually declined to take him into custody at that time, and no charges came out of that traffic stop either.
So you see these sort of allegations or incidents, But none seem to have resulted in actual criminal charges or convictions related to gang activity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you contrast that with the clear existing legal protection, the withholding of removal, that was specifically granted because of the known danger he faced in El Salvador from Barrio 18.
It's quite a contrast, which naturally led to legal challenges against the deportation.
It did almost immediately. A U.S. district court judge got the case, and they were pretty blunt.
What did they say?
The judge described the deportation as wholly lawless, said it shocks the conscience. Strong words from a federal judge.
And they didn't just comment. They ordered the administration to do something, right?
Yes. Ordered the Trump administration to actively work to get him back, to facilitate his return to the U.S.
So a direct order from the judiciary to the executive branch.
And it wasn't just that one judge. The case went up to the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals.
Yeah.
They upheld the district court's order. They agreed he needed to be brought back. One of the appeals judges even wrote separately to warn about the danger of the executive branch just ignoring court orders like this.
What was the warning specifically?
The judge suggested that if this kind of disregard for court orders becomes acceptable, it could create a precedent, potentially even leading to a situation where U.S. citizens could be deported in the future. A really serious concern about checks and balances.
Wow. So district court says bring him back. Appeals court says bring him back. Did it go higher?
It went all the way to the Supreme Court.
The highest court. And their decision.
They also ruled against the administration, essentially. They said the administration should take steps to facilitate his return and sent the case back down to the lower court to manage that process.
So multiple levels of the federal judiciary district, appeals, Supreme Court all saying, essentially, this was wrong, fix it.
You'd think that would be the end of it. But the administration continued to resist.
How do they justify resisting orders from the Supreme Court?
Their argument was basically that they didn't have the authority or the power to just demand El Salvador release him and send him back. They claimed their hands were tied.
Despite the fact that the U.S. has this agreement with El Salvador about housing deportees and presumably some diplomatic channels.
Right. They maintained they couldn't force a foreign country's hand. In fact, someone in the administration reportedly said quite bluntly that Abrego Garcia was never coming back.
Ever coming back. And what happened to the government lawyer who initially admitted it was a mistake?
That Justice Department lawyer was fired.
That sends a message. How did the original judge react to this ongoing resistance?
The district court judge was not pleased. They accused the administration of acting in bad faith for not complying with the orders.
Strong words again. Did the judge try to force compliance?
Yes. The judge issued an order demanding detailed information from the administration, even requiring officials to testify under oath about their efforts or lack thereof. That specific order got temporarily paused by a higher court, but it was expected to resume. It showed a real determination by the judiciary to enforce its ruling.
It really became a direct clash between the courts and the executive branch.
Absolutely. A classic separation of powers issue playing out in real time.
Now, obviously, this case didn't happen in a vacuum. There were political dimensions too, right?
For sure. You saw Democrats largely framing this as an issue of due process, the rule of law. They pointed to it as an example of what they saw as the Trump administration overreaching on immigration and disregarding legal constraints.
And on the other side,
Republicans tended to focus more on the national security angle, emphasizing the alleged MS-13 connection and the general threat of gangs. They framed the administration's actions as necessary, prioritizing security over the legal nuances of his status.
So the typical political fault lines were reflected here.
Pretty clearly, yes. It fit into the broader, often heated debate about immigration policy under Trump.
Beyond the U.S. politics, what about the human rights aspect being held in CE cut?
That's a huge concern. As we mentioned, conditions there are reported to be extremely harsh. Human rights groups have raised serious alarms, some even using terms like concentration camp to describe it, citing potential abuses, lack of due process within El Salvador's system, and inhumane treatment.
So his deportation didn't just violate a U.S. court order. It potentially put him in a situation where his basic human rights were at risk according to international standards.
Precisely. It adds another dimension to the severity of the situation.
This whole case really throws a spotlight on some fundamental questions, doesn't it? Like, what due process rights do non-citizens actually have when they're in the U.S.?
Exactly. And how secure are those rights when they clash with executive branch priorities, especially around national security or immigration enforcement?
And that separation of powers issue we talked about.
Yeah.
I mean, if the executive can just ignore court orders in a case like this, What does that mean for the system of checks and balances?
It's a critical question. The courts rely on the executive branch to enforce their rulings. If that relationship breaks down, it potentially undermines the entire judicial function.
There was also that really alarming suggestion, apparently floated by President Trump himself, about potentially deporting U.S. citizens to places like Seacot in the future.
Yes, that caused a huge uproar, and rightly so. Deporting U.S. citizens is constitutionally prohibited, while there's been talk about potentially stripping citizenship denaturalization from those suspected of things like gang ties.
That would still require a whole legal process, right? You can't just declare someone not a citizen.
Exactly. It would have to go through the courts. The idea of just deporting citizens is way outside constitutional bounds, but the fact it was even mentioned in this context was chilling for many observers.
And what about El Salvador's role in all this? You mentioned the agreement, but what was their stance publicly?
It's interesting. President Bukele of El Salvador had initially seemed quite willing to cooperate with the U.S. on deportations, even offering up CECOP.
Kind of aligning with the Trump administration's hard line.
It appeared that way. But later, as the U.S. courts were ordering Abrego Garcia's return, Bukele reportedly stated that regardless of what the U.S. wanted, Abrego Garcia would be treated as a criminal under Salvadoran law.
So El Salvador wasn't necessarily going to just hand him back, even if the U.S. administration fully complied with the court orders.
It certainly complicated the situation. It showed that El Salvador had its own interest and wouldn't simply act at the behest of the U.S., even with the existing agreements. It highlights the complexities of international relations in these cases.
It's quite the tangled web. So let's try to pull the main threads together for everyone listening.
Okay.
We have Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He had legal protection, withholding of removal, specifically stopping deportation to El Salvador due to danger.
Check.
He gets deported there anyway in what the government called an administrative error and ends up in Seacot, a very harsh prison.
Right, under an agreement where the U.S. helps fund that detention.
Then, multiple U.S. courts, district, appeals, Supreme Court order the administration to facilitate his return. But the administration resists, arguing it can't force El Salvador's hand, leading to accusations of bad faith and a major clash with the judiciary.
And all this plays out against a backdrop of political debate over immigration, national security, and serious human rights concerns about his detention.
It's a stark illustration, isn't it, of how complex immigration law is, the potential for, well, errors with massive consequences, and the very real human impact.
Absolutely. It forces you to think about the systems in place, the checks and balances, and what happens when they seem to break down. Are there enough safeguards? Is there accountability when something like this occurs?
So thinking about the bigger picture here, this case feels pretty unique, almost unprecedented. A legally protected resident deported against a court order, the executive resisting multiple judicial rulings.
It does feel like it pushes boundaries.
So what does this situation really tell us about that balance, maybe that tension, between the power of the government and the rights of individuals, even non-citizens? Is that balance shifting?
That's the deep question, isn't it?
And maybe even more fundamentally, what are the potential long-term implications if court orders, these pillars of the legal system, aren't consistently followed? Where does that lead?
Yeah, it definitely leaves you with a lot to consider about the rule of law itself.